Good Monday, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for December the 18th. Today we are reading together in Nehemiah chapters 9 and 10. Nehemiah chapters 9 and 10, which is going to contain the great confession of sin that the people offer up to God, and then tells us about the covenants that they are making, the written agreement, the binding written agreement that they are going to all sign. That is going to be a dedication to carrying out certain things, to really focusing on doing a few things for the Lord moving forward. Not that they are picking and choosing what they're going to do, but just things they're really going to focus on to make sure that they don't make the same mistakes that their forefathers had made that got them into trouble in the first place. So let's read about that here in Nehemiah chapters 9 and 10. Thanks so much for reading along with me today here in Nehemiah chapter 9, Nehemiah chapter 10, beginning in verse number 1. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse number 1. On the 24th day of this month, the Israelites assembled. They were fasting, wearing sackcloth, and that put dust on their heads. Remember, chapters 7 and 8 focus on the reading of the law and the understanding of the law and the application of the law. So this follows on the heels of that. The text says that those of the Israelite descent separated themselves from all foreigners, and they stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their ancestors. While they stood in their places, they read from the book of the law of Yahweh their God on the for a fourth of the day, and spent another fourth of the day in confession and worship to Yahweh their God. Jeshua, Bani, Kadmiel, Shebaniah, Buni, Sherebiah, Bani, and Chinani stood on the raised platform built for the Levites and cried out loudly to Yahweh their God. Then the Levites, Yeshua, Kadmiel, Bani, Hashabaniah, Sherebiah, Hodiah, Shebaniah, and Pethahiah, said, "Stand up." And they blessed Yahweh blessed be Yahweh your God from everlasting to everlasting. And then they launch into this great confession, very powerful, we find here in chapter 9. Blessed be your glorious name, and may it be exalted above all blessing and praise. You, Yahweh, are the only God. You created the heavens, the highest heavens with all their stars, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. You give life to all of them. All the stars of heaven worship you. You, Yahweh, are the God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and changed his name to Abraham. You found his heart faithful in your sight and made a covenant with him to give the land of the Canaanites, Hethites, Amorites, Perizzites, Jebusites, and Girgashites, to give it to his descendants. You have fulfilled your promise, for you are righteous. Verse number 9, you saw the oppression of our ancestors in Egypt and heard their cry at the Red Sea. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh, all his officials, and all the people of his land, for you knew how arrogantly they treated our ancestors. You made a name for yourself that endures to this day. You divided the sea before them, and they crossed through it on dry ground. You hurled their pursuers into the depths like a stone into raging water. You led them with a pillar of cloud by day and with a pillar of fire by night to illuminate the way they should go. You came down to Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven. You gave them impartial ordinances, reliable instructions, and good statutes and commands. You revealed your holy Sabbath to them, and gave them commands, statutes, and instruction through your servant Moses. You provided bread from heaven for their hunger. You brought them water from the rock for their thirst. You told them to go in and possess the land you had sworn to give them. But our ancestors acted arrogantly. They became stiff-necked and did not listen to your commands. They refused to listen and did not remember your wonders you performed among them. They became stiff-necked and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love, and you did not abandon them. even after they had cast an image of a calf for themselves and said, "This is your God who brought you out of Egypt." And they had committed terrible blasphemies. You did not abandon them in the wilderness because of your great compassion during the day. Because of your great compassion during the day, the pillar of cloud never turned away from them, guiding them on their journey. And during the night, the pillar of fire illuminated the way they should go. You sent your good spirit to instruct them. You did not withhold your manna from their mouths, and you gave them water for their thirst. You provided for them in the wilderness 40 years, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. You gave them kingdoms and peoples and established boundaries for them. They took possession of the land of King Sihon of Heshbon and of the land of King Og of Bashan. You multiplied their descendants like the stars of the sky and brought them to the land you told their ancestors to go in and possess. So their descendants went in, excuse me, and possessed the land. You subdued the Canaanites who inhabited the land before them, and handed their kings and the surrounding peoples over to them to do as they pleased with them. They captured fortified cities and fertile lands, and took possession of well-supplied houses, cisterns cut out of rock, vineyards, olive groves, and fruit trees in abundance. They ate, were filled, became prosperous, and delighted in your great goodness. But they were disobedient and rebelled against you. They flung your law behind their backs and killed your prophets who warned them in order to turn them back to you. They committed terrible blasphemies, so you handed them over to their enemies who oppressed them. In their time of distress, they cried out to you, and you heard from heaven. In your abundant compassion, you gave them deliverers who rescued them from the power of their enemies. But as soon as they had relief, they again did what was evil in your sight. So you abandoned them to the power of their enemies, who dominated them. When they cried out to you again, you heard from heaven and rescued them many times in your compassion. You warned them to turn back to your law, but they acted arrogantly and would not obey your commands. They sinned against your ordinances, which a person will live by if he does them. They stubbornly resisted, stiffened their necks, and would not obey. They were patient with them, or you were patient. You, Yahweh, were patient with them for many years. And your spirit warned them. Excuse me. Your spirit warned them through your prophets, but they would not listen. Therefore, you handed them over to the surrounding peoples. However, in your abundant compassion, you did not destroy them or abandon them, for you are gracious, for you are a gracious and compassionate God. So now, our God, the great, mighty, and awe-inspiring God who keeps his gracious covenants, do not view lightly all the hardships that have afflicted us. Your kings and leaders, our kings and leaders, our priests and prophets, our ancestors, and all your people, from the days of the Assyrian kings until today. You are righteous concerning all that has happened to us because you have acted faithfully, while we have acted wickedly. Our kings, leaders, priests, and ancestors did not obey your law or listen to your commands and warnings you gave them. When they were in their kingdom, with your abundant goodness that you gave them, and in the spacious and fertile land you set before them, they would not serve you and turned from their evil or turned from their wicked ways. Here we are today, slaves in the land you gave our ancestors, so that they could enjoy its fruit and its goodness. Here we are, slaves in it. Its abundant harvest goes to the kings you have set over us. Because of our sins, they rule over our bodies and our livestock as they please. We are in great distress. In view of all this, we are making a binding agreement in writing on a sealed document containing the names of our leaders, Levites, and priests. Those whose seals were on the documents were the governor Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, and Zedekiah, Sariah, Azariah, Jeremiah, Pashur, Amariah, Malkijah, Hatush, Shebaniah, Maluk, Harim, Merimoth, Obadiah, Daniel, Gineathon, Baruch, Meshullam, Abijah, Mijamin, Maaziah, Bilgai, and Shemaiah. These were the priests. The Levites were Yeshua, son of Azaniah, Benui, son of the sons of Henadad, Kadmiel, and their brothers, Shebaniah, Hodiah, Kelida, Peliah, Hanan, Micah, Rehob, Hashabiah, Sakur, Sherebiah, Shebaniah, Hodiah, Bani, and Beninu. The heads of the people, excuse me, were Parosh, Pahath Moab, Elam, Zatu, Bani, Buni, Asgad, Bebai, Adonijah, Bigvai, Adin, Atur, Hezekiah, Azur, Hodiah, Hashum, Bezai, Harif, Anathoth, Nebai, Magpiash, Meshullam, Hazur, Meshezabel, Zadok, Jadua, Pelatiah, Hanan, Ananiah, Hoshea, Hananiah, Hashub, uh, Halohesh, Pelha, Shobek, Rehum, Hashabna, Maaseiah, Ahijah, Hanan, Anan, Maluk, Harib, Baana. The rest of the people, the priests, Levites, gatekeepers, singers, and the temple servants, along with their wives, sons, and daughters, everyone who is able to understand, and those who and who has separated themselves from the surrounding peoples to obey the law of God, join with their noble brothers and commit themselves with a sworn oath to follow the law of God given through God's servant Moses, and to obey carefully all the commands, ordinances, and statutes of Yahweh our Lord. We will not, these are the details of the vow, some specific things that are mentioned. And I assume this has to do with things that have been left undone previously. Verse 30, we will not give our daughters in marriage to the surrounding peoples, and will not take their daughters as wives for our sons. When the surrounding peoples bring merchandise or any kind of grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath day or a holy day. We will also leave the land uncultivated in the seventh day and will cancel every debt. We will impose the following commands on ourselves: to give an eighth of an ounce of silver yearly for the service of the house of God, the bread displayed before Yahweh, the daily grain offering, the regular burnt offering, the Sabbath and the new moon offering, the appointed festivals, the holy things, the sin offerings to atone for Israel, and for all the work of the house of God. We have cast lots among the priests, Levites, and people for the donation of wood by our ancestral families at the appointed times each year. They are to bring the wood to God's house to burn on the altar of Yahweh our God, as it is written in the law. We will bring the first fruits of the land and of every fruit tree of Yahweh's house year by year. We will also bring the firstborn of our sons and our livestock as prescribed by the law, and will bring the firstborn of our herds and flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who serve in God's house. We will bring a loaf from our first batch of dough to the priest at the storerooms of the house of our God. We will also bring the first fruits of our grain offerings of every fruit tree and of the new wine and fresh oil. A tenth of our land's produce belongs to Levites, for Levites are to collect the 1/10 offering of our agricultural towns. A priest from Aaron's descendant is to accompany the Levites when they collect the tenth, and the Levites are to take a tenth of this offering to the storerooms of the treasury of the house of God, of our God. For the Israelites and the Levites are to bring the contributions of grain, new wine, and fresh oil to the storerooms where the articles of the sanctuary are kept, and where the priests who minister are, along with the gatekeepers and singers. We will not neglect the house of our God. And that is the reading of Nehemiah chapters 9 and 10. Again, following on the footsteps of the reading of the law and then the understanding of the law and the application of the law, we have what seems to be a further response to the reading of the law. What we have here within this text is very similar to what we've seen previously in various texts of the Old Testament up to this point. I think about Deuteronomy. There's kind of a retelling of the history of Israel up until that point, and some lessons that the people need to be reminded of. I think it's happened a couple of times since then as well. But really what we have here is a recounting of the history of God's interaction with his people. And this really focuses, I believe, on the faithfulness of God and the compassion of God, and how the people have failed to live up to what is expected of them as they are in covenant with us, with such a faithful and compassionate God. This speech, this prayer, this I don't really know. I guess we'll call it a confession. That really is, I guess, what it is. This confession, um, excuse me, this confession that is spoken to God begins with just the praise of God for his greatness in creation, that this is who they are speaking to. They are not just speaking to just anyone, but they're speaking to the creator of all things. They speak of God's goodness, beginning in verse number 7, calling out Abraham, and they speak of God's faithfulness in that he has fulfilled his promise and that he is righteous. Um, when Abraham's people were in Egypt and oppressed, God's compassion, which is the main theme here, his compassion that is spoken about at least six times by my count, in verses 17, 19, 27, 28, and twice in verse 31. This compassion moved him to perform signs and wonders against Pharaoh and to bring his people out of Egypt. And while they were on the way, there was the pillar of cloud that led them by day, the pillar of fire by night. Um, and God spoke to them the law. He did not leave them uneducated or ignorant, but he spoke to them concerning the law and let them know everything that they needed to know in order to be pleasing to him. But the issue, beginning of verse 16, is that the people did not honor that covenant. Excuse me. They acted arrogantly. They were stiff necked. They did not listen. They refused to listen. They did not remember. They cast an image. They committed terrible blasphemies. And because of all this, or I should say, even in the face of all this, God was forgiving. God was gracious. God was compassionate. Verse 17. God did not leave them abandoned in the wilderness because of that great compassion. Verse 19. His spirit was even with them and instructing them. God provided for them. So really, the emphasis certainly within this confession is on God's compassion and just how faithful He has been to His people, even though they were not faithful in their response to God's faithfulness. Again, Israel is able to do all sorts of incredible things, verses 23 through 25, and God blessed them in an abundant way. But they were disobedient. They rebelled. Again, they committed terrible blasphemies. Because of that, God handed them over to their enemies. Um, but again, even in their punishment, once again, verse 27, in your abundant compassion, you gave them deliverers who rescued them from the power of their enemies. I think this might be referring to the time of the judges. But again, remember the judges' cycle. As soon as they had relief, what did they do? They again did what was evil in your sight. So this time he abandoned them to the power of their enemies. But whenever Israel cried out to them again, you heard from heaven, you rescued many times in what? In your compassion. You warned them to turn back to your law, warned them to turn back to your law, but they acted arrogantly, did not obey. They sinned against your ordinances. They stubbornly resisted. They were stiff. They stiffened their necks. They would not obey. So what happened? Even though God was patient with them, even though God warned them abundantly through his prophets, they would not listen. Therefore, you handed them over to the surrounding peoples, even though in your abundant compassion, they did not destroy them, or you did not destroy them or abandon them, for you are a gracious and compassionate God. But instead, what happens? Well, they went away into captivity. They went away into captivity for some time. Um, but eventually, what did God do? God brought them back from captivity. But what did he bring them back into? He brought them back into the land, yes. But their status in the land, excuse me, was not as it was previously. Instead of being the top dogs in the land, verses 36, 37, we're here, but we're slaves in the land. Our harvest goes to the kings that you've set over us. But notice, there's an acknowledgement here. They've been set over us, yes, but they're set over us because of our sins. So this confession acknowledges the sins of the people. It acknowledges that, and it acknowledges all throughout that God has been faithful, that this is not a failure on God's part, but it's a failure on the part of the people. So in view of all this, in view of the great distress that they're in view of their bodies being rolled over and their livestock being rolled over by these kings, they are making binding agreements, written on a sealed document containing the names of our leaders, the Levites and the priests, because again, the people are going to go as leadership goes. So the leaders are committing themselves to doing what is right. But not only them, but the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, all their wives, all the sons, daughters, everyone who's able to understand. They made a commitment to this document, this agreement. But what was the basis of the agreement? The basis of the agreement was to follow the law of God given through God's servant Moses and to obey carefully all the commands, ordinances, and statutes of Yahweh our God. So it's basically just a recommitment to the law. That's what we have going on here, which is something we've seen again on a number of occasions throughout the text so far, is the people recognizing that there needs to be a revitalization in their commitment to God's law. And most time that comes because they recognize that God's law has not been obeyed as it needs to be obeyed. So there's a recommitment that needs to take place. Now, there are some specific things that are mentioned. Number one, there's going to be no intermarriage. Remember, that was an issue we dealt with in Ezra. But there also needs to be an honoring of the Sabbaths, that they're not going to be doing business on the Sabbath, and they're going to allow the land to rest on the Sabbath years. They're also going to honor what I wrote down is kind of a taxation to support the temple, the work of the temple and everything that was done with it. And then finally, they're going to honor the first fruit stipulations of the law, that God deserves the first of everything because he is the one who's provided it. Therefore, he's going to receive the first of it. Now, the way God receives the first of things is sometimes done through, again, the support of the temple and those who work within it. So they're going to give the first fruits of the land. They're going to give the first fruits of every tree to Yahweh's house year by year. They're going to bring the first fruits of our sons and our livestock. And again, remember going back, the way they're going to do that is whenever they come to offer their sons, they'd actually give a sacrifice in place of their sons. That's something we talked about long ago as we're reading through Leviticus, I think it was, the details of the law. They're also going to bring the first fruits of the grain offerings, every fruit tree, every new wine, every fresh oil. A tenth of our land's produce belongs to the Levites, for the Levites are to collect the 1/10 offering in our agricultural towns. So again, all this is given back to the Lord, sometimes given to the Lord through sacrifice, but also sometimes given to the Lord through supporting those who work for him within the temple setting. So again, all of this is being done in recognition of how good God has been to them and what is demanded, what is then demanded of them in order to honor that. Again, think about God's compassion that is mentioned again on a number of occasions, at least 6 times. Excuse me, written explicitly, verses 17, 19, 27, 28, 31, and 31. It is his compassion that has allowed them to even be at this point. Now, granted, this point in their history is not the greatest of points in their history. Again, they are in their land, yes, but they are in their land and being ruled by another. But even in that situation, which they know they're there because of their own mistakes, they still see God's compassion. And they're going to honor God's compassion. They're going to honor his faithfulness through a commitment to following his law. And really, that's what life as a person of God really can be boiled down to. Because of what God has done for us, we must honor him. We must seek to show him our appreciation through what we give to him, and through how really what we give to him is all of ourselves. And like we talked about like we talked about yesterday in our lesson, God demands all of us. He doesn't just demand a part of us or portions of us. He demands all of us. We must give our lives entirely to him. And the Israelites set the standard for that they were to give so much tangibly of themselves to God, and it was in response to his compassion, in response to his faithfulness. We show faithfulness because he first has done that. We love God because he first loved us. If you have any questions or comments about this text, please feel free to leave that in the comments section below. And I appreciate you taking some time to read along with me today. Our reading tomorrow is going to consist of those who resettled within Jerusalem, which means we're going to be reading some more names. So we'll get through that tomorrow. And then we'll finish up reading through Nehemiah on Wednesday, reading chapter 13. And then we'll be getting into Esther on Thursday, read a couple of chapters for Esther on Thursday, and then Friday we should be back on schedule after our lack of readings whenever I was on my sick bed. So we should be back on schedule here towards the end of the week. I do appreciate you reading along today. If you have any questions or comments about these chapters, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below. And I appreciate you taking some time to read along with me today. Hope you'll be back again tomorrow as we read together again through Nehemiah chapters 11 and 12. Take care and God bless.